Well, Malcolm Davis is a senior analyst in defence strategy and capability at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Kindly joins me on the line now from Canberra. Would you say, Malcolm, I mean, everyone seems to be anticipating now this is the counteroffensive because we're seeing like at least a three-pronged attack, Bakhmut, Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia at the same time. Is it?
Look, I think it's certainly the early stages of that counteroffensive. It could certainly be seen as probing actions or shaping actions to try and identify weak points in the Russian defences. And then usually the way these things happen is once a weak point is identified, the main force then pushes through and exploits the weak point, breaks out, and then follow-on forces proceed to follow on, in effect. So this is where we're at the moment. We're seeing a series of probes and advances by the Ukrainians to identify those weak points, with the main force following behind.
I've heard it suggested that Ukraine's plan here is to try and break the Russian-held territory in two, to burst through at some point, maybe as you said, find a weak spot and break through, separate their territory and get right through to the Sea of Azov. And that potentially would isolate Crimea. I just wondered what you think about that as a suggestion.
I think that's a logical approach. And I think certainly if the Ukrainians can isolate and cut off Crimea, that gives them a great deal of opportunity then in the spring and the summer of 2024 to then move into Crimea itself and recapture Crimea. And that is a critical step for the Ukrainians, because if they don't recapture Crimea, if Russia keeps hold of that, then in effect, not only have Ukrainians ceded territory, which is unacceptable to them, but the Russians then have territory from which they can launch further attacks in the future. So the Ukrainians have to capture all of their territory, but I think Crimea is probably high on the priority list in comparison to places like Donetsk and Luhansk.
Russia's had a lot of time to anticipate this counteroffensive, and by all accounts, they have dug in some pretty well entrenched defensive positions. You're an expert in defence analysis. Does being on the defensive side here give them some advantage or not?
It's always easier to defend than attack. But having said that, if the Russians have dug in, they may very well have strong defenses, but the quality of their troops, the morale of their troops, the fighting spirit of those troops really needs to be then considered. You know, just how ready are the Russians to fight back after many months of essentially being on a battering by the Ukrainian long-range fires and by seeing defeat after defeat. And remember, an awful lot of these troops could be essentially reservists and conscripts that have been mobilized with very little training. So you might have these strong physical defenses in terms of defensive lines, but if the fighting spirit and the morale is not there on the part of the troops, then it will be relatively straightforward for the Ukrainians to find those weak points, break through, and then exploit that breakthrough.
Some really interesting insights. I really appreciate your time. Malcolm Davis, my guest, who's a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute.